Welcome to Conversations on Modern Slavery. My name is Bryon Lippincott, Head of Communications and Digital Engagement at Free the Slaves. Conversations on Modern Slavery is a production of Free the Slaves. It explores the complexity of modern slavery across the world, looking at its drivers, its manifestations, and its consequences. Featuring discussions about the latest research conducted by Free the Slaves and dialogues with eminent experts and frontline practitioners, this podcast seeks to amplify public awareness and galvanize action against modern slavery by providing insights into the root causes, critical challenges, and pioneering solutions. Conversations on Modern Slavery is a must-listen for everyone passionate about eradicating slavery. Today I'm joined by Dr. Marta Furlan and Jackline Mwende to discuss the origins and framework of our recently released research on survivor engagement. This episode is part one of a two-part series on this research project. Part two will feature the interviews with survivors who participated as researchers in the project. Marta and Jackline, welcome to Conversations on Modern Slavery.
Hi, Bryon. Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Hi, thank you for inviting us to this podcast.
I think I'd like to start today with a background question for Jackline, our survivor engagement lead here at Free the Slaves. What is survivor engagement in the context of human trafficking and modern slavery? The term has become very popular over the last few years, but I think it has the potential to mean different things to different people. Can you explain what we mean by survivor engagement in the context of Free the Slaves' work and in the context of this research?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this question. Survivor engagement is a very broad term that is used by organizations when they are describing their interaction with survivors. But what we've come to realize is that survivor engagement has levels of engagement, because when we were doing the research and we had a question about how do you engage survivors to organization, we got a sense that any interaction with a survivor, whether it was providing services or giving empowerment or supporting leadership opportunities for these survivors, was considered as survivor engagement. But for the context of the research and Free the Slaves, what we were looking at is survivor engagement beyond service delivery. Looking at the traditional, not looking at survivors on the traditional perspective of survivors as recipients of services, but survivors as leaders and advocates. So basically, that is the trajectory that Free the Slaves is taking. This is our trajectory, but you could find a different definition of survivor engagement with different organizations in the movement. But for us is the need for a paradigm shift in recognizing survivors as leaders and advocates, not just beneficiaries and recipients of services. Thank you.
Thank you for that really good explanation of how we see survivor engagement. I guess you provided a little bit of context already into the scope of the research, but I think it'd be interesting to talk about why was the research done in the first place? What needs were you seeing in East and Central Africa with program delivery or partnership formation, even survivor network building and support? What are the conditions in that region that helped you come to the conclusion that we needed this research?
When FTS was breaking ground in East and Central Africa, and we were building, a cohort of organizations that we would be working with, one thing we found a challenge is that we could not find a survivor-led organization, neither could we find the survivors. But when you look at the reports, the TIP reports by organizations, they are talking about hundreds and hundreds of survivors. But these survivors were nowhere to be seen in the tables where policies are made. And also even in high-level forums, like the Freedom from Slavery Forum that we were running, for a long time, the Freedom from Slavery Forum, there were organizations that work with survivors. But the question was, where are these survivors? Do they have a voice? So that's one of the things that brought that idea of the research on the ground. We wanted to bring the survivor voices in the movement as peers, as experts of lived experience, as leaders, as advocates. So that is one of the things that informed, because the research targeted organizations that work with survivors or claim to work with survivors. So the question was, where are these survivors? How do you engage them? Of all of those survivors, and there are some survivors who want to be leaders and advocates, but they have not found the correct platform, or they are not being empowered enough to do so. So that was basically, in a nutshell, what this research was investigating. Thank you.
So a follow-up question, I guess, to that is, when you started out with this research, what questions were you wanting to answer?
Okay, thank you. So one question was, how do organizations engage survivors beyond service delivery? That is one. Two, what are the spaces that are available in organizations and beyond organizations for survivors to engage? So those were one of the, some of the questions that we were seeking to answer.
Okay, so part of the research then was to figure out if there's spaces for survivors to engage in the movement beyond service delivery. Are there places for internships, program support, program management, leadership, all of those things? And then figuring out what that looks like across those different organizations. Okay, excellent. So now I'm going to turn to Marta. How did we carry out this research? If we're talking in academic terms, what methodology did we use? But practically, how did we go about collecting the data and making sure that it was reliable and all of that?
Yes, thank you, Bryon, for this question. So basically, after developing the research questions as outlined by Jackline, we figured that a mixed method approach that combines both quantitative and qualitative approaches would be the best fitting for this specific research. And the methods that we adopted for collecting data were: first, we reviewed and analyzed the secondary sources, which includes guidelines, policies, academic papers, reports that discuss survivor engagement practices in the anti-trafficking movement, both globally and within the East and Central Africa region. Secondly, we conducted semi-structured interviews with the 18 survivors from Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, and South Sudan, so from a variety of countries within the region. And we selected participants that were referred to us by organizations that we work with in the region and that are active in the anti-trafficking movement. Thirdly, we administered an online survey to anti-trafficking organizations in East and Central Africa to hear from them how they are approaching survivor engagement. And finally, we had a validation workshop with those survivors who participated in the research to review the findings collectively, discuss the recommendations, channel the perspectives and the insights of survivors into the final version of the report, and minimize the risk that the researchers from Free the Slaves and HAART Kenya, that was our partner organization in this project, would inadvertently misinterpret the data. Now, from a methodological perspective, a distinctive contribution of this research was the active, multifaceted, and continuous participation of survivors. So on the one hand, survivors contributed as researchers, so they underwent first training in qualitative research skills. And then they participated in conducting the interviews, analyzing the data, identifying key findings, and developing recommendations. On the other hand, we had another group of survivors that contributed to the research as respondents. So they shared their personal experiences, their insights, and their perceptions regarding survivor engagement practices. And an important consideration that I would like to add in this regard is that the role of survivors as active participants to the research is something that has evolved and deepened over time. So while their engagement began as a research assistant, gradually as we moved forward, they took on more roles, more responsibilities, and they truly affirmed themselves as researchers and co-authors. So it has been a process of professional and personal growth for survivors involved in this research throughout the process. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that detailed description of the survivor engagement in the process. Conducting this type of research with multiple sets of research subjects in different locations is always complex. And then doing it in the field of anti-trafficking, modern slavery, with survivors in multiple roles as well, makes it even more complex. So I think we want to talk about two different aspects of that complexity here. The first is ethics of research in terms of how did we approach this from a research ethics perspective? What did we do to make sure that people were safeguarded in terms of trauma, in terms of unintentional harm, all of that type of thing as we designed and implemented the research? That's the first thing we'll talk about. And then the second is the ethics of survivor engagement. How do we manage the ethics of integrating survivors into not just our research as subjects, but also as participants, and the interactions between them and organizations, privacy, all of those things. So I'll go to Marta first. Can you describe our process for managing the research ethics and how that was handled for this research?
Yes, thank you, Bryon. This is a very, very important question. And as you rightly said, doing research on human trafficking with human participants always poses a series of ethical challenges that need to be addressed properly and adequately, and even more so when doing research with the survivors, so with people with lived experience. Now, throughout the duration of this research, we have conformed to the highest ethical standards. And what did it mean in practice? It meant that participants were given comprehensive information, and they were provided voluntary informed consent forms before the interview process started. And they were assured that the anonymity would be preserved throughout the research process. Also, something very important is that professional psychological support was available during and after the interviews in those cases in which it would emerge as being necessary. The interviews were recorded, but the audio recordings were handled with sensitivity, meaning that they were only used for transcription purposes. Once the transcript was available, they were deleted in order to better protect the confidentiality and the privacy of the respondents. And during the data analysis process, anonymity was again fully respected. Everyone that was involved in the data analysis process, from the research teams of the two organizations, for the Slaves and HAART Kenya, and the survivors taking part in the research process as co-researchers, were trained on how to handle information sensitively and responsibly. As I mentioned before, the participants, the survivors that were targeted to carry out the interviews to act as respondents were identified through organizations that had been working with those survivors for a number of years. And this was very important to ensure that there was a relationship of trust in place, to make sure that people wouldn't feel pressure to share their information with us. Also, when doing the interview, a comfortable setting was predisposed. Whenever possible, it was given to the survivors the opportunity of choosing where to have the interview. In the interview process, the presence of survivors as co-researchers was also very helpful to ensure a climate of trust, of mutual respect and support, and to make sure that there wouldn't be a situation in which the power disparity between a researcher and respondent would affect the dynamic of the conversation. No one was asked among the respondents to share their personal experience of being trafficked, so personal experiences were not part of the conversation unless they were brought into the discussion by the respondent himself or herself. And whenever this was needed or whenever we were requested to do so, breaks were taken throughout the interview process to give to the person the opportunity and time to decompress from the conversation. So I think these are some of the key points that we followed as we underwent the research process to make sure that our research would be trauma-informed and ethical from the conception until the data analysis and the production of the final report.
Thank you, Marta, for that really in-depth description of how we handled the ethics of the research. I want to go to Jackline now. When we say ethics of survivor engagement, what do we mean? What are the things we should be considering? And then how did those considerations inform the practice of this research and the inclusion of survivors throughout this project?
Okay, great. So the ethics of survivor engagement, first, it requires that if you're talking about survivor engagement first, you have to practice what you're preaching. So this was the research where survivors needed to be there from the start, from the conceptualization, from the implementation of the research, not just as subjects of the research. Because traditional researchers that, do this kind of thing would just have researchers who would go and interview survivors and organizations. But the idea was they have to be there in the start, be part of the researchers and everything. So that was one of the, driving force of the research or the foundations of the research. Secondly, in ethics of survivor engagement, the issue of compensation is important in terms of having survivors compensated for their time and also their expertise in the process. So this is something that was discussed before, and they were given contracts which we took them through and we discussed back and forth. This is the budget that we have, and this is what we need to do. And that was done, especially for the research assistants. And then there was a training for the research assistants. So we believe that survivors should be able, if they engage in a research, to be able to gain some knowledge of how research is done. So we took a considerable amount of time, almost 2 months, doing the trainings 3 days a week. For the survivor, for the ethics of research, the process of research, and even the tools of the research. And in that, after that, then we were able to co-create. So Free the Slaves and HAART Kenya did not come up with a questionnaire that should be used. We just sat down and developed questions. And those questions were even taken through a test where, they would ask themselves, is this question triggering or not? And some questions were omitted from the questionnaire. And so that was a way of having a trauma-informed questionnaire and a process. And then also, we also taught them how to conduct a trauma-informed research. What should be done in a research when you see the participant is triggered or the participant is not emotionally stable? What are the safeguards you can take as a research? And also there was the idea that you can stop a research at any point if the ethics have been breached. That was very, very, very clear. So for us, survivor engagement in terms of the research meant that the process was important as the outcome. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I think it's really important to understand the amount of investment that has to go into these projects. Obviously, it costs money, it costs staff time, but it's also a large social and an emotional investment, educational investment in making sure that everyone can participate equally in that. Is that accurate?
Yes. So one thing I usually advise organizations that are, taking the route of survivor engagement is that the usual structures of project management might not apply. That is what we've learned. And I'm always asking myself if Free the Slaves were doing that project as a funding, because that project came from unrestricted funding. That is how it was funded. But if it was funded from a project, we had done researches before with academic institutions, and the research were very, there was a lot of pressure on deadlines, on the research, on when to deliver. That's why it was very impossible for Free the Slaves to conduct that research with maybe a learning institution or having a donor to support it who has a timeline. Because originally, the research was supposed to take 3 months. It took 1.5 years. And through that time, we learned a lot because we were like, let's let things flow. We are not going to give things deadline. If the research assistants don't understand the task, we have to go back and repeat again. So even the training was supposed to be 3 days, ended up to being 2 months. Even the co-creation of the questionnaire was supposed to be 1 day. We did that thing for 2 weeks. So even trying to train them on how to conduct interview. So we had to do a repeat of the test until they were in a position where they said they were comfortable. So that was a learning curve for us as an organization, that there is a lot of the emotional part you've talked about, and there's a lot of patience as an organization you have to adopt when you are working with survivors, especially if you want them to reach a specific level. Because in service provision, you can set your deadline. I will issue this and this within this period of time. But when it becomes to empowerment, the survivors are different. The capacity of them to grasp processes and concepts is different. And you have to work with them and bring them in a space where you can say, okay, even if they are not all at the same level of knowledge, at least we have something we can work with. And that takes time and patience.
Also, something that strikes me as important when discussing the time that needs to be invested by all parties involved into a research project of this nature is the fact that the engagement of survivors as researchers wasn't something that was predefined entirely at the very beginning. Rather, it was something that developed very naturally, step by step. So first, survivors engaged as co-researchers, undergoing training, as Jackline was describing, and conducting the interviews, collecting data. Then, once that step had been successful and the survivors themselves wanted to be involved in something more, a further step was designed and taken, whereby they would be involved also in data analysis, and then report writing, and then the validation workshop at the very end. So this was also something that was built up very naturally, step by step, by survivors and organizations discussing together at every stage of the research process. And I think this also is saying a lot about the kind of time and the attention that needs to be paid throughout the process.
Yeah, and also to add, since the issue of survivor engagement is the new buzzword in town, so it means there's no many best practices to learn from. So what I would advise organizations, just let it flow, because for us, nobody could have anticipated how this research would have gone. We never knew it would take that long. Even the steps that came, when we were moving on, we were hoping for that. Both organizations were funding from unrestricted funding. So it was very possible for us to be able to be very flexible in the process, because there is not, maybe, if we do another research involving survivors, we could have a framework or guidelines that can help future organizations to be able to do. But for now, as we speak, I think that is not there out there. We are now, this is the testing phase of this process of survivor engagement.
Okay, excellent. That's really helpful. And I mean, not maybe for me personally, because I'm not doing research with survivors, but for organizations to kind of have an idea of how that process evolved, I think is really important. And so I want to follow up on that. It sounds to me like, from what you're describing, that this was a very much a relationship building process between the participating survivors and the organizations and the researchers, people, like Marta, who are working on the research. So I guess my question is, I feel like often expectations are things that really can be challenging within projects, within relationships, especially in the survivor organization relationship space. So I guess, how did you manage expectations throughout this process is the first part of the question. And then the second part of that question would be, what advice do you have for other organizations who are moving into survivor engagement, whether it's research, leadership, program management, whatever, related to expectations and how to manage that within these processes? Because I think you've probably learned a lot about that through this year and a half of engagement.
Okay, thank you so much. So in terms of expectations, I think one thing to preempt expectations is communication. Prior communication. If that I think we spend a chunk of time just talking, trying to find out, how do we want to do this? Why do we want? Because I remember even when we started, everybody has a different idea, including the research assistants, what we are looking for in the research. And with time, we had now to agree on, this is what we want to look at in the research. This is exactly the questions we need answers. There are other questions that we might need them answered in terms of survivor engagement, but this is what we are concentrating in. And I think that took also a few days to agree on what we are going to be, to be focusing on. And then also getting the buy-in of the survivor, because if you approach survivor engagement as peers sitting in the same table who have a common shared goal and want to reach somewhere, then it helps. Expectations come when there is a sense of hierarchy that has been unconsciously or subconsciously introduced. So when there is an hierarchy, it means there is a receiver and a giver. And that's how expectations are built. But if this is our thing, we are in this together, you find that there is no expectation, it's just commitments and obligations and understanding. So that is actually this research, we did not get any of that during this research because we spent a lot of time in the foundation of it. So when we were moving, they understood everything, because even when we reached a point and their task has ended, because the original plan was they help with the data collection and all that, and then we realized as the research team, we need them more for the analysis. We also need them more for the dissemination, and now we need more for the implementation. And it went there naturally, and we were able to transition every step all the way, because first, we never promised something that we were not able to give. We even exceeded beyond our promises of what the survivors we were engaging were expecting.
Marta, anything to add to that?
Well, no, I think Jackline did an excellent job in sharing how we handled this process to make sure that the expectations were handled in a conscious and respectful way. So I don't think I would have anything to add.
Okay, thank you. One final question in that note. The one I hear you talking about all of this, it sounds like time expectations, like your ability to remove time expectations and constraints in terms of timelines was really important in that process. Because I think when you're introducing anyone to a new skill set, a new topic, a new role, often timelines and urgency can become a huge deal. And it sounds like you were able to eliminate that urgency and that timeline pressure in a way that really facilitated inclusion and belonging in that space that might not have been there otherwise.
And I think that came not by design, it was accidental, because originally the project had a timeline, very fixed timeline. But once we started rolling, we realized this is not realistic, this is not going to work. Because I think there is a time we shifted it to 6 months. Then it was we revised, I think we had revised that timeline 3 times until we realized, oh, okay, this is not, it's not the way we think it should be. And I think that was just a learning. The research involving survivors, especially if you are involving them in the, as part of the researchers, I think that research cannot work like the other researches that we are used to. Because for one, I kept wondering, because I knew our partner is academic-based, university that we do research with. Even today, I usually grapple with, if we were to do a research with them, with the survivors, would it work? I still think it can't work because of the protocols of how academic institutions have for research and how long things should take. So I think in terms of survivor engagement, now, because we do not have the guidelines or the framework or something a blueprint that we can look at, it's good for people just to make time in the vicinity for now until we get the lessons right. Maybe in 4 years, we would have gotten how long should it take for real.
I think that's important, like that, to be able to acknowledge that flexibility is a considerable part of this process, I think is important information because of those expectations and the challenges that can come with them. So I realize that we've actually been talking for quite a while already, and we haven't even talked about what any of the outcomes of this research were. So let's move ahead and kind of discuss, what did you learn and what recommendations emerged from this research?
Okay, maybe I can start. So one of the findings was that organizations are more on service delivery more than engaging beyond service delivery. Most organizations, I think almost 90% of the organizations that we interviewed, that is where they stopped, service delivering, and that's all. Then we also realized a very interesting thing, that engagements, whether service delivery or even beyond service delivery, were more geared towards survivors who are female. So there was a learning lesson that the male survivor is isolated from the movement, because even those who say they have shelters, those shelters are for women and girls. There are no shelter for men, survivors. So that was something that I found very interesting in the research, the gender question, as well as what organizations believe to be survivor engagement. Because there was, the question was, how do you engage survivors? And you would see, we provide shelter, we provide healthcare, that was it, because the question was, do you engage survivors beyond service delivery? And then also in terms of policies, most organizations engage survivors in a ad hoc way. So there was no specific policy that they were using for survivor engagement. It was just like they come and they would have maybe an intake procedure and everything, but after the survivors received whatever they received help, there was no other, blueprint, maybe even in the HR manual, or even in the, whatever internship or policy of the organization, or, all that. Most organizations did not have that. They were doing it, just, ad hoc, or in a ad hoc way. Yeah.
And I think something that was interesting from the survey with organizations was that there seemed to be an interest on part of organizations to improve, enhance, strengthen their approach to survivor engagement. So many of them are engaging survivors mostly as interns, volunteers, public speakers on specific events, but they're not offering them fully fledged positions within their organization as the staff. Nonetheless, there seemed to be some interest on the part of organizations to change this approach in the near future and to open up more opportunities for survivors to be full-time staff within the organization. However, they also identify a series of limitations, a series of reasons why they are not yet in the position of doing so, which include finances. Many organizations reported that they do not have the finances necessary to engage survivors beyond those positions of volunteers, interns, public speakers, and know-how. They feel they do not have the tools to engage survivors adequately and consistently. So I think this tells us a lot about where are we standing as a movement, or where we want to be moving towards, and the distance that we still have to walk to reach that ideal point where we aim to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I think one of the challenges when we looked at the survivors who were interviewed was that, when you ask them the level of education that they have reached, so you find that in analyzing that, I would say that some of them were not able to get into those positions because of maybe the level of their education, and also how, for example, adverts for positions are crafted. They might say survivors are highly encouraged to apply, but they need a survivor with a degree, with a bachelor's degree. They don't have that. Most of them don't have that. So that's why you'll find there are some survivors who are educated, but that is the exception. Most of them, the reason actually why they were trafficked is because of, the more you are less educated, the lesser choices you have for economic empowerment. So that is something that I would say a recommendation that survivor organizations should invest in building the capacity of survivors to be able to be in those spaces, whether even offering scholarship, getting them back to school, getting them their degree, getting them to their GRE or whatever, so that they can be able to compete effectively. Because my worry is that right now we are engaging survivors at their level, but it will come a time that, because I was even telling the survivors I work with, now we are able to engage you even if you are not, you don't have a bachelor's degree or a diploma, but there's a time that is coming that there will be survivors who are well educated and you will have to compete with them for these positions. So it's time for you to go back to school if you can.
Thank you for both of those perspectives. I think, having read a lot of the academic research on survivor experiences, particularly focused on Asia more than Africa, that correlates a lot with what I've read in terms of the challenges faced with education, and then also survivor engagement as a whole, like being primarily service delivery and not having either the training capacity or the financial capacity to invest in survivors and help them integrate into the movement and become leaders. I think all of that aligns a lot and it both supports and is supported by existing research that is out there across the movement, across the sector. So I guess the next question to follow up on that then is, what can we learn from this? What does our research have in terms of generalizability? Can we take things from this research and apply them other places, or should it be mostly considered in the context of East and Central Africa?
And I think that some of the recommendations that emerged from our research that we developed based on the findings that we collected would resonate also beyond East and Central Africa. They would be relevant to other geographical contexts. But, and here is a big but to be added, we shouldn't be automatically assuming that what we found in this region applies to other contexts, especially geographical contexts, but even more importantly, cultural contexts. So I think one of the reasons why at Free the Slaves, moving ahead in terms of research program, one of the next steps would be to build on this very important research done in East and Central Africa and replicate it into other geographies to see what similarities and differences can we find out, can emerge from having the same research in another context. It could be Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, West Africa, and I think in the next months and years, it will be extremely interesting for anti-trafficking organizations to see what synergies and what differences are there in different geographic and cultural contexts when it comes to engaging survivors.
Yeah, I really agree with the cultural aspect of it. Maybe it could work in where, the culture, maybe in the whole of Africa, I would say that research can apply. Because we looked at countries that are very diverse in culture in Africa. We had Cameroon, DRC, Kenya, South Sudan, very different, Malawi. So very different in their cultures on how they do things. But there's one culture, which is the African culture. I would say the African culture of, respecting and not questioning somebody who has helped you, or even trying to, to walk away from someone who has helped you. That is a culture that, was very embedded in the research finding. Such you find that even when we were trying to get the research done, I remember there's one organization that requested to be sent the questions so that they answer them on behalf of the survivors. And we say it's not possible. You have to bring them on phone or camera, and we have to talk to them in person. And then there's also an organization that wanted to be there when the survivor was being interviewed. And we say, no, you cannot be there. We want them to be able to speak. There's also some survivors who, felt that they will be betraying the organization if they are speaking about this research and talking. We had to assure them that it will be anonymous. Even when we are bringing out the analysis of the research, it will be impossible to pinpoint who said what, So there was that. And me looking at this, that is very African, the hierarchy thing is very, very serious in Africa. Because I have interacted with survivors from North America and Canada, and it was a different ballgame. They can speak their own, they can walk in spaces, they can demand what they feel is their right. So survivors in North America and Canada, they know what is their rights and they will demand it. In Africa, that is different. They are obliged. Sometimes we had to remove the narrative in their head, because sometimes it's like, oh, if it was not for this person, I would not have been there. And it was, I remember during the academy, there's a survivor who knelt down before Giselle, and we had to, no, you cannot kneel down. You can't. So they are like, this is where we show appreciation for me to be accepted in the academy. We're like, no. That is not how it works. That can never happen in North America, So maybe the research could work there, and maybe Asia somehow, because it's also that. But if we want to do for North America and Canada on how survivors engage with organizations, I think maybe we might find different findings. And I'm very curious what we would find there. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. And I think it will be so interesting then for an organization such as Free the Slaves that has a global scope of operations to then, at the end of this research process, encompassing different regions, to see what policy or what approach of survivor engagement can be considered a global one, and then what specificities will need to be developed at the regional level. I think this will be very interesting moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would also want to see about Asia, because also the influence of religion, different religions there. And also MENA region. I would love to see how it turns out. Yeah.
I think the cultural aspect is fascinating. As I live in Asia and have been in Asia for 10 years, I would say there are some of those things that you've described about Africa that are similar in Asia in terms of hierarchical respect and some of those things. So I think some of those things, probably there's elements that transfer in varying gradients and degrees, even between South Asia, Southeast Asia, and like East Asia. Like if you think China, Korea, Mongolia, up that direction, like you would have different cultural aspects across those three different regions of Asia, or even Central Asia would be very different as well. So I think all of it would be fascinating. Hopefully somebody out there wants to fund all of that and we can find out. So I know that you guys have both talked a little bit about next steps, but I think we should revisit it kind of as a formal question. Let's start with Marta. What are our next research steps based on this project?
Yes, thank you. So as I mentioned, the next step would be to build on this research as the starting point and replicate the research in other regions in which freed slaves is active. So the first challenge will be to identify which is the most appropriate region where to start from, and take it from there. Identify to what extent can we apply the same approach, the methodology. The questionnaire will have to be adapted to the local context. So there will be certainly a series of changes and adjustments to be made, but the idea is to replicate this research into another region to identify similarities and differences. Are there different limitations, challenges, gaps, needs that we need to be aware of and need to be respondent to, and use it to then inform our approach to survivor engagement in that region.
Yeah. And I was also thinking of one time we think about now targeting the survivor-led organization, ask them how is their experience engaging in the movement? Are there any challenges or recommendations? It's survivor-led organization because they are working along. They are the minority. When you come, for example, in the forum, you find we have like 4 survivor-led organizations. The rest are not. So what are some of the challenges these survivor-led organizations that are led by survivors face in the movement, in engaging in the anti-slavery movement? That's just my one of my thinking. So in terms of the next step for the research, in terms of implementation and program implementation for East and Central Africa, now we are currently working with the organization. First, the organizations that were part of the research and other organizations who were brought after the research, who are very interested in the findings. So to walk with them a journey of creating policies for their own organization internally that are very responsive to having survivors in capacities of decision making in those organizations, or having survivors pathway to empowerment in that organization. Just opening up, even finding solutions to where organizations saying we do not have money to hire survivors, our budget is fixed. What are the other alternatives that you can still engage organization? Because I gave them an example of, if you are a CEO of an organization, but it's a small organization, you don't have extra funding, you only have funding for whatever you are doing there. What you can do is, if you're going for meetings, government meetings, stakeholder meetings, tag a survivor along, have survivors that, move with you, mentor them along the way. That can also happen. So those are some of the things that we are thinking through with the cohort of organizations, especially in Kenya, on how we can, infiltrate survivors in the movement.
Excellent. I know one of the things that you mentioned earlier in regards to what you found in the research was that people felt like they lacked the skills to engage survivors well in their organizations, in leadership or in empowerment activities. So how are we addressing that as a result of this research?
Yeah, so I think this comes at an opportune moment. So for the previous months and weeks, Free the Slaves has been doing that kind of training for staff. So the idea is getting this training out on survivor engagement to organizations, now tailoring it to organizations that are engaging survivors. And I think that is a discussion that the regional aides we are going to have, and see how we are going to, support organizations that we work with. Because the idea of Free the Slaves is that we are not going to get a survivor who is standalone. We are getting survivors that are affiliated to organizations, because we believe we might not be able to cater every need of a survivor, and we need allies that are able to, to chip in. As I said, where service delivery ends is where empowerment starts. And we start, that's where we are starting. So we need an organization there holding the turf for us. So those organizations are the ones that we will be targeting to see if they understand their survivor engagement in a detailed way, not just by practice, but also the theory of it, of survivor engagement, and the philosophy behind it.
Okay. Excellent. That sounds like exciting next steps for both the research and for the practical implementation of the knowledge. That kind of comes to the end of our conversation. So I guess I'd like to open the floor up for either of you. If you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share about the research, about the process, anything, we can do that, and then we'll close the episode.
Well, I think to conclude, I would just like to say that I'm hoping that this research sets a bit of an example that other organizations will be willing and enthusiastic to follow. We are certainly looking forward to doing, as I said, more of this research, but also to doing it together with the local and regional partners. So it would be wonderful moving ahead to have a similar research project in a different region and to carry it out with an organization from that region. So I mentioned this in order for organizations out there listening to this podcast who have an interest in survivor engagement, research, participatory practices, to please feel free and welcome to reach out to us, because this could be the beginning of a wonderful research project carried out together.
Excellent. Jackline, any final thoughts?
I think my final thoughts is just that this is just the beginning of a global movement on survivor engagement. So I'm excited to look to see how, the time unfolds this new way of looking at things, the new paradigm shift we are having. Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. So just to summarize that, if you are interested in engaging with Free the Slaves related to survivor engagement or anti-human trafficking or modern slavery research, either on survivor engagement or other aspects, we have a wide variety of research that is ongoing. We would be happy to hear from you, and you can reach us at info@freetheslaves.net, and we'll make sure it gets to the right people. So again, as we close this episode, I would like to thank Marta and Jackline for taking the time to share about this important research. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, this is part 1 of a 2-part series on the research. Our next episode will feature interviews with the survivor leaders who participated in the project as researchers. So stay tuned, subscribe if you haven't already to be notified when that episode is released. This podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.